I really want us to use this opportunity to hear about and think about some ways of understanding the current economy and the necessary new economy. One person asked me once, why do you talk about a new economy? I said, it's simple, because the old one doesn't work. But let's go back a little bit. In March of 1969, a great American contemporary philosopher and social analyst issued a profound statement that was at once a critique of the welfare state and a challenge to the social movements. He said, well, let me just show you.
I don't want nobody to give me nothing. Open up the door, I'll get it myself. I don't want nobody to give me nothing. Open up the door, I'll get it myself.
Now, somebody asked me if I was going to share a joke. I said, no, it's not a joke. It's serious. If you listen to what James Brown says in that song, again, spring of 1969, on the heels of the Black Power movement, it is a critique of the welfare state. It is indeed saying that, no, we're not looking for, bigger welfare payments. We want some doors of opportunity open so we will be able to get things ourselves. And that's the second part of the challenge to the social movements, because if indeed there are doors that are not open, then that ought to be the task, rather than simply providing things, which he said, that's not what the intention was. There's a lot of meaning in that. It sums up the aspirations toward self-reliance, toward independence, while recognizing the existence of obstacles. There's a false dichotomy that is sometimes made between people doing things for themselves and struggling for power or engaging in political stuff. It's not like these are two separate things that can't be done at the same time, because quite frankly, it is the capacity to enable people to do things for themselves that could be at root a very, very important part of what a social movement needs to take up. So, if we listen to James Brown and think about, now what does this mean? What is this door? What's on the other side of the door? Who's got the keys to the door? You can begin to develop an analysis about the nature of the current economy and what we need to do about it. First, I want to talk about some wrong answers. There are a lot of people who would just simply tell you, well, education is the key. I've heard that so many times. And education is certainly very important. They would tell you that education is the key that would unlock the door of ignorance and unpreparedness and will open you up to a world of opportunity and riches. So if any of you have heard me talk about fish, you know what I think about education all by itself, that just knowing stuff is not all that's required. But I'm not going to talk about fish right today. I think Eli Fugazi and his crew made it terribly easy for people to get access to that on YouTube. So what I want to do today, though, is different. I want to talk to you about ham sandwiches. Because I think the issue of a ham sandwich will help us understand what's on the other side of James Brown's door much better than the fish story does. So let's talk about it. The fish thing said teach a person to fish. Let's talk about give a person a ham sandwich they can eat for a day, teach a person how to ham sandwich and they'll eat for a lifetime. No, that doesn't work. See, because fortunately, fish is both a noun and a verb, and ham sandwich typically isn't. So let's make it a verb. Let's say, teach a person how to make a ham sandwich and they'll eat for a lifetime. Well, even that doesn't quite hold together because there's a problem. Knowing how to eat a ham sandwich in the absence of having some bread, some ham, some condiments, maybe some foil to wrap it in, just knowing how to make one is not going to feed you for the rest of your life. That pretty quickly. So what would you need? What needs to be on the other side of that door so that you can have this lifetime supply of ham sandwiches? Now, I know this sounds like a very narrow food selection. Some people in this room probably don't even eat ham. I love them though, so just bear with me for a minute. What would have to be on the other side of the door in order to enable you to get a ham sandwich is some pigs, some place to grow them, some land to grow the corn that you're going to have to feed them, some fields of wheat, some place to grind it, some machinery to bake the wheat into bread, some distribution mechanism that gets you to, I mean, there's some things that you need in order to do this. Now, that's painfully obvious if you're talking about a ham sandwich, but somehow it wasn't as obvious when people were talking about fish, and there's a reason why. It's really important for us to understand the persistence of the fish story. The reason the fish story can still be told without people telling you, well, that's ridiculous, you don't have what you really need, is because fishing and water is the closest thing we have left to the commons and common economic activity. Even though there are certainly some conditions in which the water holes can be locked up and people without the gear that they would need. For most other kinds of things that aren't about water and the abundant fish life that lives in water, it would be clear that you have to have the things that you need to produce these pieces of life, these life-giving needs, things that would satisfy your ability to eat. And that's caught up in having some access to these means of production or the capital that's required to do it, whether it's the bauxite mine for the raw material for the aluminum that then and the rolling mills to make it into foil. There's stuff that you need. So knowledge in and of itself isn't important. I mean, isn't sufficient. I'm not trying to say at all that it's not important. It's not sufficient. Bear with me here. There are other kinds of ways that people would identify that the keys to whatever this door is that needs to be open for people to have opportunity would include things like networking or political action or the right to vote. All of those things are important, every single one of them. But none of them are sufficient if you do not have access to the means of production. And where are they? They are carefully locked away as the private property of an increasingly small group of people who use them to benefit themselves and do not make them democratically available to the people who need them. So what James Brown is thinking about is a situation where what's on the other side of that door ought to be held in the commons, but it isn't. What is on the other side of the door, those means of production that are right now tied up with the private property relations, and that's the barrier, that's the door that we have to figure out some ways to open. Now, how does somebody get the right to restrict the access to what people need in order to live? My contention is that your access to opportunities to be productive is in fact your access to life itself. That if you don't have a way of making the things that you need, you're essentially reduced to being a beggar, asking other people to make sure that you have those things that you need. So there are lots of dialogues about rights, and rights are very, very important. But at the point you have to talk about your right to food, it is on the basis of someone already having taken away from you your ability to provide that for yourself. That's when you have to call on somebody else to make sure that you get it. This idea that the things that we need in order to be productive are somehow locked away from us is an idea that I think should connect us to thinking about the significance and the importance of reclaiming the commons, reclaiming our opportunity to do things for ourselves. And I would claim that we cannot reclaim and rebuild and renew and express our full humanity unless we are able to reclaim, rebuild, renew, and utilize the commons. Because our humanity is tied up in our ability to access the things we need in order to be the productive people that we are capable of being. The other night I was at a local music establishment in Greensboro, North Carolina, where a lot of singer-songwriters gather, and a lot of music lovers of all ages gather to listen to them. And I heard somebody on the stage singing a song that included this in the lyrics: "I'm sick of life, why don't I dream anymore?" When you hear young people singing that, we should have the clear idea that we need to do something. I'm sick of life. Why don't I dream anymore? Is that the society we want? I don't think so. I think that the enclosure of the commons was a violent attack on our beings and on our souls, on our spirit, on our ability to be the full people that we're capable of being. Now, this is the idea of the tragedy of the commons, the view that the commons can't really be held in common by a community as part of its collective wealth because somebody would cheat and utilize too much of it and destroy or wipe out the resources. And so therefore it's important that private property be established so that these private property owners will be the stewards of these resources. As though somehow they're going to steward these resources in such a way that it's not going to use them up and deplete them. I think we can look at the world we're living in, and that's the joke, not the James Brown piece. This stewardship is not happening, and in fact, what has actually happened is that these property relations, some of these property relations were justified in this piece that John Locke wrote on his second treatise on property, but he included in there, he said that people have a right to the product of their own labor, and as such, that if people go onto this common land and improve that land and do some work to improve it, then they have a right to call that theirs. It's in second treatise. He said, except to the extent that their doing so would infringe on other people's right to do so. Somehow that last part has been left out of most people's justification for the types of private property rights that exist now that in fact do exactly that exactly prevent other people from exercising the same rights. So here we have people who are supposed to be stewards or justify their existence as being stewards of these public spaces, but in doing so, destroying them. And I mean that. I mean, we know what is happening to the environment. I mean, the idea that you can blow the top off of a mountain, give me a break. So this is the kind of stewardship of these environments. It reminds me of the twisted logic of the pacification programs in Vietnam where they talked about we had to destroy the village in order to save it. Yeah. This doesn't make a lot of sense. The stewards of what should have been the public wealth and resources have abandoned any notion of responsibility to the common good and instead use their control to simply extend their own comfort, their own wealth, and their own control. They've lost all connection to the idea of democracy, of being of, by, and for the people. And instead they extol the idea that they deserve this disproportionate share of the socially produced wealth as example of some abstract right to property, or some divine right that was somehow given them for either objectively for having, most of them for having wealthy parents, or for having gotten lucky with the early development of some process, and got some lucky temporary head start. And one of the things that happens that I find almost amazing in terms of its irrationality is that a lot of the people who have these excessive connections to wealth have almost set themselves apart as a separate species from the rest of us. If you listen to people who don't think that fast food workers should even make $10 an hour, while they are reaping millions of dollars annually out of the value produced by the labor of those workers, you have to begin to ask yourself, what in the world would you think makes that a just? I mean, are you some different species? We not all humans? Why is it that you need several $1 million a year? And there's a reason why. It's because the money most of us need is for the production of use values. And there's just so much stuff we can use. We may think that we could use a lot more, but it's just so much we can use. The money other folk get is for exchange values. And to be perfectly clear, I need to tell you the story about the vegetarian cat. Does everybody know about the vegetarian cat? There was this vegetarian cat. A lot of people didn't know there were a vegetarian cat, but there was a vegetarian cat. And this mouse had crawled out of this hole and saw this looming cat. And the mouse runs back into the hole. The cat said, oh, don't worry. The mouse goes, why not? He said, well, I'm a vegetarian. I don't like meat. I don't eat meat. And the mouse goes, oh, okay. Well, I never know about vegetarian. He said, yeah, I don't even mean. So the mouse comes on out the hole, whereupon the cat pounces on it and sticks its fangs into its lung and its heart. And the mouse on its last dying breath says, I thought you said you were a vegetarian cat. And the vegetarian cat said, yeah, I am. He said, but I might be able to trade you for something, like a piece of lettuce or something. So here the mouse realized that the cat had no use for it. But what the mouse was not thinking about was that the cat didn't want it for its use, he wanted it for the capacity of exchanging. And we're a lot like that mouse sometimes, where we think that we live in a world where people are concerned with use values like we are, and those people who are mainly looking for exchange value will, much like that cat, sink their fangs into our very hearts, because they can take and trade their capacity to buy our labor power and work us for a little while for this ever-growing and quite insatiable drive for more and more exchange value. And that's the kind of world we live in. Now, as that is the world, that world is devastating our communities. It is devastating young people. It's destroying their lives. It's causing a lot of young people to be so desperate that many of them end up in prisons. Many of the rest of them who do not end up in prisons end up in schools that are like prisons. Not dreaming anymore. That's the situation we have. So with that level of devastation, I want to take up this question that I've seen people pondering, which is the relationship between environmental and economic justice from the standpoint of trying to identify which one is more important. And I want to offer that I think it's not a good question, because they're both incredibly important. If indeed the economy and economic justice is what you're connected with in order to live and eat, then the fact that the climate is changing and that the floodwaters will rise is no more significant to a hungry person than the danger that they might starve to death. So these are both very, very serious issues. We cannot underestimate the level of devastation that the economic situation that the United States is in right now plays on the life of people. And the only ones of us who are likely to do that and even have this as a serious kind of issue or question are the people whose privilege within that economic system is high enough so they're not worried about starving to death. And for them, the question of the poisoning of the air and the rising of the seawater is the one that they have to mainly be considered with. So they would then say that we have to slow some of these economic development things in order to make sure that we don't damage the planet. And I think it's just as wrong to say we have to slow the environmental regulations so that we don't damage the economy. I think both of those are mistaken kind of notions. But on this whole idea that we are damaging the planet, I just want to make really clear what's going on here. The planet itself is resilient. It's been here a long time, way before we were. And the planet is capable of, it outlived the dinosaurs, and they were pretty big, powerful things. And I know we think we're smart, but we're just so smart that we're capable of damaging the planet's capacity to sustain our lives. And that's what the damage, but now if that's the damage to the planet that we have to worry about, and I think that's a really important damage, can you see why the person whose life is already being destroyed because they're hungry can't find that any more important than the damage? I mean, it's not the planet that's going to go away, it's the ability of the planet to keep people alive. Well, starving to death also won't keep you alive. So we have to work these things together. So as we are worried about the removal of those mountaintops, we have to worry about the people in those communities who are saying that our life was connected with coal mining. That's how we eat. Now you're talking about doing something, so you need to care about whether or not I eat as much as you care about that mountain. So they're together, they stay together, they don't come apart. One is not more important than the other. I think it's really worth driving that home, and that the only reason we would think that one was more important than the other is if we have a certain kind of class privilege that makes us not have to worry about some of the economic realities that are facts of daily life in other communities. There's another point that I want to make about one of the current dialogues and discussions going on about new economy work, which has to do with inequality. A lot of people are excited about Piketty's work. A lot of people want to talk about income inequality. Robert Reich is talking about it a lot, Joseph Stiglitz and others. I think that first of all, the discussion around any income inequality, except for those obscenely high incomes that are objectively wealth transfers, it's kind of missing the point. It's not income, it's typically wealth inequality that is the issue. But I saw a piece that someone had written that said, well, how much, in fact, Robert Reich said it in his piece too. He said, we're not exactly sure how much inequality is too much. Because a certain level of inequality, he posited, helps motivate people. My contention is that needing to eat is motivation enough for most of the folk I know. But they think that a certain level of inequality is going to help motivate people. So we want to make sure that there's enough inequality to motivate people, but not so much inequality that it damages the economy. So how much inequality? And another piece I read, it said, well, maybe we should let the philosophers and ethicists figure this out. How much inequality is enough or too much? And I'm thinking, not with their class bias, why in the world would I want to let a bunch of ethicists and philosophers decide how much inequality is too much? Strikes me as a democratic question of community standards. But more than that, it misses the question. Because I'm not talking about the quantitative aspect of how much is enough or too much. I'm talking about the qualitative thing, which has to do with that door again, which is the inequality that allows one group of people to control whether or not another group of people get a chance to be productive citizens and produce the things and open doors and get things for themselves. However much or little inequality that is too much. Because the idea that one group of people is controlling the life destiny of another in that way is in itself obscene, all right? But I want to share somebody else with you that I'm not sure how many people here know about the work of General Baker? He wasn't a military guy. Can we run the General Baker clip?
The lessons are innumerable over and over again about the tactics and the struggles that we had to use, how to broaden it and base our support in the community, that we could fight back and resist, how not to get tied down in fighting the battle on their terms, to establish what terms we're going to fight this battle on and carry it out in our interests and not theirs. All those tactical questions came out of the struggle just for survival inside the shops. And lo and behold, Chicago, by the time we finished most of those battles, then we confronted with this thing where all the robots began to enter the plant. And all the work that you've done to advance your cause inside the plant for jobs and things are now being eliminated in mass by robots. And the whole struggle for equality and stuff at the workforce has been transferred into a struggle for survival. Survival, plain and simply, because we got no way to live. And so that poses the questions we got now. Really, I mean, without jobs, how are we supposed to live? There are no jobs on the horizon, but does that mean that a job means that's your ticket to livelihood? I mean, you can't live without a job. Is that the kind of contradiction of the world we're fighting for? Because it's clear to us now that the robots are so much more productive than we were, that they don't need us in the workplace. So now we got to pose the question about how we're going to live in the current world. So you're talking about a real change in the system that we're living under, and people's perspective of what the jobs have been. So much. I mean, jobs is used as a discipline in the family. You know, the kids get old enough and say, "Get out and get a job." Well, how you gonna do that now? Well, it ain't none. You know what I mean? So this whole question of jobs and how we live and what kind of society we're gonna have and who got a right to live and who doesn't, who can eat and who can have a home and who can't. All those questions are being thrown into us as real moral questions that we got to deal with. And even though we fight to resist the attacks that's put up on us, we got to have a kind of a vision of what kind of world we want. And base our support.
That gentleman was General Baker. I never knew him personally. He passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was one of the leading figures in the Detroit Revolutionary Union movement. There was an organization with that name called DRUM. He was one of the founding members of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Was deeply involved, worked 40 years in the auto plants. So what he's talking about is out of his direct experience. 40 years, his family was 3 generations in the auto plants. His father came up from Georgia. He worked at the auto plants. His children worked in the auto plants. And now essentially the auto plants in Detroit are no more. And he says it raises this moral question: how are we going to live? He says we have to envision the world that we want to live in. There are questions of who will have a right to have a house, who will be able to eat, who's going to be able to live. That's the seriousness of the things that we're talking about. So when I started thinking about how we imagine the world that we want to live in, I started thinking about what would it mean if wealth were truly democratized. What is that notion? What is the democratization of wealth? What is the democratization of finance? Because finance becomes the kind of concentrated embodiment of those means of production. If you have access to wealth, you can buy those fields that we have to grow the corn and the wheat in. You can buy the grinding equipment to grind them. You can buy the stock to start your pig operation. You can smoke it, you can make your ham sandwiches. You can do that with access to finance. And what would a democratic access to finance? Well, North Dakota has a little lesson to us because they have a state bank that's done quite well. Credit unions began to tell us another answer because these are democratic financial institutions owned by their investors, by the people who make deposits there. So we know something about that, but we have to learn and figure out something about local banking. We have to figure out something about state banking. We have to figure out how to build a national development bank that would work with infrastructure. We might need to build national development banks that look into the question of reparations. You know, think about the hundreds of years that some people labored on the soils of this country and helped to build up and accumulate the enormous wealth that is still sitting in insurance companies, banks, financial institutions around, wealth that came directly out of the inhumanity of slavery. Well, doesn't there need to be a development bank that go into the communities that remain without that wealth and help them to develop the kind of entities that would allow every person in those communities to live a fully productive life, to do what James Brown is looking to do, open up the doors so they can get it themselves? So the democratization of wealth is not a loose phrase. We have to begin to try to figure out how to do it concretely. We want to figure out how to democratize the creativity that's in communities. What kind of democratic spaces do we have? Do we need, growing numbers of hacker spaces? Do we need more opportunities for young people to engage their musical talents and their creative talents to build things? There are all kinds of things like that we have to do when we begin to imagine the world that we want to live in that is a democratic world. Because to me, the key to all of this is democracy. That's the hardest part, is how to make democracy work. How in the world do you get a bunch of folk who all have different experiences, different trajectories, different proclivities, different inclinations, different desires, and get them working on stuff where they can work on it together? So some people think of democracy in its mechanical terms, like, well, what should the vote system look like? And that can be important under some conditions. But I like to think of democracy mostly as creating opportunities for people to think together. Because my contention is that if we could all come into this room and think together, the things that we think of together would be much more powerful, much more robust, much more informed than all of the things we thought about before we came into this room, and we're just looking for some mechanism to register our thoughts. So I really want us to all begin thinking more and more about democracy as the creation of opportunities for people to think together. I have offered as a challenge to most people who know me that said, I don't mind being in any group where you can give me voice and you can have a vote. Because if I can't convince somebody else of what I'm talking about, it's not going to happen anyway. So it's not just a question of registering a bunch of opinions. It is a question of creating opportunities so that people can think together, and on the basis of that, develop very, very much higher thoughts than ever before. There are a couple more important things I want to get to, and I'm going to try to stop in time for us to have some questions to popcorn out of the audience. I want to talk about the fact of how important it is for us to be inclusive in our work. And I use the word inclusive very deliberately, and I do not mean to say diverse, even though I'm not going to be mad at you if you talk about you want to fight for diversity, but I want to talk about why I think, and I want you to hear me, inclusion is more important. When I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas, so I was involved indirectly in the integration of Little Rock Central High School. My sister went there several years before I did. I still went there in the 60s, the early 60s, which, and a lot of other school districts hadn't integrated at all by then, and Little Rock had for several years since that stuff happened in 1957. And then years later, I saw people arguing that this fight that we had been in around inclusion to again get some doors open, and literally they locked the doors, they put soldiers in front of the doors and told children that they couldn't go to a high school. I saw people go from talking about that to creating these massive busing plans that had people in neighborhoods who did not even want to go to the other school forced to go. In my own individual family, I want to say this is a slight diversion, but I think it's worth hearing. I don't get to tell this story much. I'm on stage. I get to do it tonight. In my family, my oldest brother would have been in the same class that went there the first year in 1957. So he had been a classmate of Ernest Green, who was one of the first people to graduate from Little Rock Central. But he didn't want to go. He wanted to go to the black high school. In fact, he told me, he said, I wouldn't have thought of giving up my chance to run for president of the student council and be in the band in order to go integrate some school. He didn't want to do it. And that was fine. My parents respected that. He didn't go. My sister, who had seen lynch mobs on television, said that when she saw those lynch mobs, she knew she had to go there because she had to prove to people that she was just as good as they were. I said, yeah, I wanted to prove to them I was just as smart as. She said that wasn't what she had said. She said she wanted to prove that she was just as good as they were. This was a mission. So tell people she's the only person I know that was recruited to a high school by a lynch mob. My brother, in between that sister and I, didn't want to go. He went to the other high school, played in the band, made model rockets. I wanted to go. Now here were 4 children with the same 2 parents who cared about us. 2 of us did one thing, 2 of us did something else. This was a decision that got a chance to be made in my home. Later, that decision was being made by judges, school boards, and NAACP chapters filing suits. And what I have told people, I said that was ridiculous to me to engage in making people go to school whether they wanted to or not. I said that's like changing the laws against mixed marriages. Y'all heard the word miscegenation? There used to be miscegenation laws that made it illegal for blacks to marry white. That would be like doing away with those barriers and then going out and insisting that black people had to all marry somebody white. In other words, once you do away with the barrier, that doesn't necessarily open the door. It didn't say push me through it. And I just think that that's important. So I'm thinking about inclusion is our ability to open doors, to make opportunities for people to come in. And in particular, we have to care about, be conscious of, and explicit about the inclusion of the people we see being excluded. So right now I'm working with the Southern Grassroots Economies Project that has as our focus group of the people we work on in the South, those people most excluded from participation in the economic system, those people least likely to benefit from any small recovery that takes place. This is the core constituency that we're working on and trying to be inclusive in making sure that they're there. We're not running out to make sure that every potential ethnic group in the world is invited. We're looking around us and see who has been excluded, and let's make sure that they are included. And I think much of our work needs to be characterized by that, fighting for inclusion, even if, and as distinct from thinking that there's just a certain amount of diversity that you have to have. Now, I mean, diversity is good because it leads to a certain kind of robustness. That's fine. But it is inclusion that is the vital thing, that is the justice element of that I would offer to people that need to think about. So, I've said a lot about reclaiming the commons, reclaiming our lives, reclaiming our full humanity. There's some words we need to reclaim. First of all, I want to reclaim the words concentration of wealth and power as dirty words. I don't want it to pass that off as though that's something that's kind of okay, and no. I want to reclaim the idea that that the kind of wages paid to certain people are indeed redistributions of social wealth. People have made redistribution a dirty word. I want to add to that some of those wages are indeed redistribution and that they're wrong. And I want to make sure that we are able to talk about these things and make it real. There's a way to think about power. There are three kind of things about power that I got a chance to talk about a year ago at Reroute. One is the power can crush you, and indeed it will. The other is that power can help you if you organize it and you advocate to it. The third is that you can become sources of power. So one of the things that we've seen and give appropriate praise to is a number of people who are speaking truth to power. But that is the existing power that you speak truth to. That's the existing power that you resist. So that more than speaking truth to power, we need to learn how to be true to ourselves and organize and develop the amount of power that's necessary for us to meet our own needs. This is a very, very important thing that we have to do. The last thing I want to say before we open up for some questions is that this won't happen without opposition. We saw what happened to the Occupy movement when people were camping out. One of the most frightening things to people who oppose the development of a new economy is the possibility that we are actually able to do things for ourselves. Because one of the ways that this old economy is able to exist is on this notion that there is no other way. There is no alternative. Tina, there is no alternative. To that, we must resolutely and consistently tell people, TAMA, T-A-M-A, there are many alternatives. There are many alternatives that put the accumulated wealth in the social democratic arena rather than having it in the individual control of folks. We have to decide, like General Baker said, the kind of world that we want to live in. It needs to be a democratic world. It needs to be a world of, by, and for the people. The people who oppose it will be particularly frightened when they see us learning how to do some things for ourselves. There's a story of the 1919 general strike in Washington State, where it was at the point when folks allowed the trash pickup to continue and kept the bakeries open so they could bake bread, that the powers that be realized, oh, this is serious. They're in this for the long haul. We have to be in this for the long haul. This work isn't going to be easy. An analogy I used once is it's like we're building a cathedral and all we're doing right now is carrying some big heavy rocks. And people can laugh at us if they want to, but at some point we will have built this enormous, amazing edifice that everybody will be able to equally and fairly make use of. But in the meantime, we're just carrying these rocks. It's a long, hard struggle. It will continue. That's why barbecued ribs and blues joints are so important to me. I'm going to Mississippi in a couple of weeks to go to a blues festival. But I've been doing this work for 50 years now. I probably won't make another 50 out of it, but I'm going to get as close as I can. And I welcome the presence of so many people in this room who have become incredibly skilled and talented and knowledgeable about so many of the things that we need to work on together, that we can use this opportunity this weekend to think together so that we can open up the door for people to get it themselves. Thank you very much. Questions? So we were going to Esteban has a microphone. If people have a hand up and somebody would like to ask a question, and Rachel has another one. If somebody would like to ask a question, I'll make some effort to answer it, and you'll probably give me a chance to do a part of the speech that I didn't read.
Hands way up high.
Thank you very much for your speech. I too am a big fan of blues joints and barbecues, and I was wondering if you could speak to the role of sort of radically loving people as it comes to building community and being in this for the long haul.
I couldn't quite hear you.
A little closer? Okay.
Yes.
So as a lover of blues and of juke joints, I was wondering if you could speak to the role of radically loving people and building community and being in this work towards the long haul.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it's all about people. It's all about loving people and loving people's humanity and respecting people's creativity and capacities. It's about not separating people into those who have and those who don't. Anyone ever see Parks and Rec? There's a Netflix show. One time on there, this guy was saying, he's a comedian, so I won't blame him for this. He said, capitalism is God's way of letting you know who's smart and who deserves to be poor. See, I don't believe that. I believe that people who are poor have been denied opportunities to do some things that, if they were given, can be encouraged to be a part of a very, very productive, very dynamic society. And you have to care about people to make sure that that happens. You have to meet people where they are to make sure that that happens. And I think that that's part of the work of all of us. Very important.
I'd be interested to know, as a fellow citizen of North Carolina, what you see are some practical steps, other than Moral Monday, which is doing great stuff in our state, but some practical steps to bringing about the change that you're talking about.
I think in addition to, Moral Monday is a powerful piece of mainly resistance work and somewhat advocacy work. I think where it doesn't yet meet up with what are the needs that are related to figuring out how to construct a new economy is that it isn't yet working on the aspect of the work that we need to do for ourselves. So I'm involved in a lot of cooperative economic development work around trying to help people build democratic economic entities in their communities to meet community needs, to develop community wealth, and to create jobs. I think a lot of that work has to be done. I think we have to find ways to engage political people and existing structures that have the power of taxation to use community-based democratic resources to make sure that that happens. I think that currently we have a situation where when the market fails, we end up inviting individual entrepreneurs to deal with this market failure by guaranteeing those entrepreneurs their individual profitability. So cities will buy things at below market, at least at market rate, sell them to a developer at below market rate in order to help guarantee the profitability of what the developer is doing, in the hope that some social benefit will trickle down for that. I think we need to find a different way to do it, where we directly help to enable communities to do this, where they end up being community-owned assets that are just as eligible for tax revenue support as our individual entrepreneurs. So there are a lot of things like that that I think we need to be doing more of. But it's about meeting people's needs and the incredible needs that exist in communities with democratic approaches that enlist the people themselves in identifying the needs and helping to be part of the solution.
Thank you very much for your words tonight. My name is Trina Jackson. I live in Boston, and I'm from Kentucky originally, so I heard Kentucky up there on the stage, so just want to shout out to my fellow native. So in your speech, you talked a lot about reparations, or a little bit about reparations, and I don't know if you've seen the article in The Atlantic written by, I can't remember the brother's name, Hennessy Coates, about reparations. So, you know, like, the reality is that a lot of people do not like the idea of reparations, even people on the left, even progressives, right? There's this whole question about, well, what do reparations look really about? So my question to you is if you can speak to what do you think the real issue is with reparations? Why are we so not sure about it? And what do we really need to kind of push the conversation? Thank you.
Okay, I can answer that. First of all, a lot of folk think that the whole idea of reparation is to give some people who are too lazy to work some money so they don't have to work to get it and they're just going to have something, and that this is going to damage the work incentive. That's kind of the right-wing critique of it. There are a lot of people further to the left who are confused, who say it's not politically going anywhere, that they're confused about who would get it, how you would distribute it, and all that. What I'm talking about is, again, returning to community part of the wealth that was created by the historical existence of those communities, not the individuals. I'm not for the gigantic Cadillac Nike giveaway where you write a bunch of checks and about 2 months later, Cadillac and Nike got these big spikes in their in their revenues from sales and stuff. You know, it's like, I had some money and I got rims. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about creating development banks so that we can help create some of the kind of entities to meet people's needs in those communities. I don't think that the dialogue around reparations has ever reached the point to making, some real clarity about how you would do something that would ultimately take this social crime and have a social solution to it, because most of the examples people have used have been for individual reparations, like the ones that the Japanese internees got, the ones that certain Jewish folks got after the end of World War II, those kind of individual reparations. I'm talking about another means of creating some developmental financial entities that allow us to create enterprises that can meet people's needs. So I think that, I haven't heard people argue very much against that because I haven't heard that put out very much. So I think it's one of the ways to do it, and part of why it's important is, again, this was a social injury that I think deserves a social response, not an individual injury that we're looking for an individual. Like, who had a granddaddy who was a slave and how many hours a week did he work? It's like, I don't know. But I know that there were whole communities that have been stripped of that have had this wealth extracted from them. That didn't just happen during slavery, it happened during slavery, during Jim Crow. It's happening today with not only black folk, but white working class people in places where you can find them. So there are a lot of ways that this reparations argument just takes on a portion of the general economic landscape that has been a part of the whole exploitative economic system that this country's been engaged with forever.
Okay, we have time for just one last question, which is over here.
My name is Ushnish from the University of Toronto. Just want to expand on one of the questions you asked, which is
to meet people where they are, to engage often from points of vulnerability. You don't want to go into a room all the time claiming you're the smartest person in the room. That's just not, you want to be vulnerable and learn from the people that you're working with, and in doing so, invite people to participate in some of these more creative spaces. I really, really appreciate having had a chance to be here tonight with you all. I'm going to be here the whole weekend. We're going to have lots and lots and lots of other discussions. I'm going to go up in some of the workshops and argue with people if I get a chance to. And I'm going to have fun and go home energized and ready to do some more work, as will all of us. So thank you very much for all of us being here.